Okay, so we can start with 3 times homage to the Buddha. And today is November 14th, 2015. So we start with the homage to the Buddha 3 times. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, so today we will be continuing with the study of Sutta number 140. Is blinding you?
It's blinding. You know where to bring it down, right?
If we bring it up, bring it up here, then we could.
Yeah, I got it. Thanks.
That's better.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay, so we are continuing with the study of Sutta number 140 in the Majjhima Nikāya. This is called the Dhātuvibhanga Sutta, the Discourse on the Analysis of Elements. And before we resume where I left off last week, I'll just recapitulate the material that we've covered so far. So first, there's a little story behind this discourse that the Buddha arrives at a potter's shed, or he arrives at a potter's home, and he asks permission from the potter to spend the night in the potter's shed. And the potter tells the Buddha that it's quite all right with him, but there's already another ascetic, a renunciant, who is calm and is staying in that shed. And so the Buddha goes to the shed, asks whether it's all right for him to stay there, and the other ascetic welcomes him, not knowing that he's the Buddha. And then they meditate through much of the night. Then late in the night, the Buddha opens a conversation with this young man and asks him, under whom has he gone forth? Who is his teacher? And the young man, according to the commentary, the young man was actually formerly the king of Takashila, which was in the state of Gandhara. That's in the northeast, present-day Pakistan, eastern Afghanistan. And after learning about the Dhamma through some merchants, this king renounced the kingdom, and on his own he took on the robes and went forth out of faith in the Buddha, though he had never met the Buddha before. And so he's come to this potter shed, and the Buddha opens this conversation, and the young man tells the Buddha that he has gone forth under or out of faith in the ascetic Gautama, whom they call the Buddha. The Buddha asks him, have you ever seen this Buddha before? And he says, no. And of course, since there were no photographs or TV in those days, he has no visual impression of what the Buddha looks like. And so the Buddha says, I'll teach you the Dhamma, and he starts to give a teaching to the young man who still doesn't know that this is the Buddha who is teaching him. Okay, then the Buddha opens the discourse by going through first an outline of certain topics, which in effect are sort of homing in directly, very directly on the teaching of non-self or selflessness. And according to the commentary, this is because that young man, when he was, even before he met the Buddha, just on his own from some of the discourses of the Buddha that he had heard and read about, had started to practice, he had started to practice meditation on his own, and without any outside guidance, he had already attained the 4 jhanas, the 4 meditative absorptions. So he had strong samadhi or concentration. What he was lacking was the teaching on insight or on wisdom. So the Buddha goes directly into wisdom teachings by teaching him that the person consists of the 6 elements, the 6 sense bases, the 18 kinds of mental exploration. Then he speaks about 4 foundations, the 4 adhitthana, foundations or standpoints. And these 4 foundations are wisdom, the 4 foundations are wisdom, truth, relinquishment, and peace. Okay, then the Buddha picks up on the teaching of wisdom, that one should not neglect wisdom. And then to expound or to explain this statement, not neglecting wisdom, the Buddha explains to him the meditation on the 6 elements, going through the 4 material elements, the space element, and then the consciousness element, which he treats in terms of the contemplation of feeling. And then he takes the feeling through successively more refined levels until, here on page 1092, paragraph 20, there remains only equanimity, purified and bright. And so this, as we explained last week, seems to be the equanimity of the 4th jhana. And this is representing the consciousness element. And then the Buddha says that the meditator understands that if he were to direct this equanimity, pure and bright, to the base of infinite space, the base of infinite consciousness, the base of nothingness, the base of neither perception nor non-perception, then his consciousness might remain there for a very long time. This is indicating that if he develops the 4 formless or immaterial meditative attainments, the karma that's empowering that consciousness will direct the consciousness to rebirth into the 4, one of the 4 formless realms of existence, where the consciousness might remain for thousands of kalpas. Kalpas are the periods of cosmic expansion and contraction. But then the meditator realizes that if he were to direct that equanimity to any of these formless bases and to develop his mind accordingly, that would be conditioned. In a way, this is the key statement in the sutta, that even these very refined, very exalted, immaterial or formless meditative absorptions are conditioned. They are sort of underlying them, there is a subtle clinging. And because of that, the meditator, by seeing that all of these states are conditioned, he does not generate any volition tending towards either existence or non-existence, tending either from a wish to abide in these formless realms for thousands and tens of thousands of kalpas, nor does he seek annihilation, personal annihilation. So not generating any volition tending towards either existence or non-existence. He does not cling to anything in this world. And so through non-clinging, there is no agitation. Without agitation, he personally attains Nibbana and understands birth is finished, the holy life has been lived, what had to be done has been done. There is no more coming back to any state of being. Okay, so that is the point that we reached last week. And some people after the class, they asked me about this verb. I mentioned that there's a verb in Pali which has two nuances that get combined. Actually, a verb in Pali that represents two different Sanskrit verbs which somehow get merged and conflated in Pali. And this is the verb that I represent here rather inadequately by the expression, he is not agitated. So the Pali verb is paritasati. Pari is just a prefix, so the real stem part of the verb is tasati. Okay, now this represents, coming from Sanskrit, we have a verb paritrishyate, which means to have craving. And it's actually related to the English word thirst, you can see. You can see there's some similarity. And there's also from trishyate that we get in Sanskrit the noun Trishna. You know, Hare Krishna. And that becomes, in Pali, Trishna becomes in Pali tanha, which is the word for craving. So from the verb trishyate, we get Trishna, Sanskrit, and Trishna is, I should say, the equivalent, the Sanskrit equivalent of Pali tanha. Because in Pali, we don't have these two letters, and so the R usually turns into an A or sometimes a U. And the sh sound is too hard to replicate in Pali, so it becomes tanha. So we have paritrishyate, giving paritasati, and this means to crave, to have, literally to have thirst in the sense of strong desire, to crave. But then there's another Sanskrit verb, trasyate, which means to be afraid. And if we want to represent trasyate in Pali, it would become also tasati. And so this verb also feeds in to paritasati. So paritasati has these two nuances of craving and fear. And it's not somebody who suggested to me, well, that shows the psychological connection between craving and fear. And I say that there might be such a psychological connection, but that's not the reason for this. This is purely what you might call a coincidence, a linguistic coincidence, that two verbs which are quite different in Sanskrit, when they get converted into Pali, they take on almost the same forms. Okay, so that brings us where we came last week, was up to this would be the attainment of arahantship, the realization of nibbana, and then what's called the reviewing knowledge, or the reflective knowledge, that one has finished the job, so to speak, by eradicating all craving and putting an end to the cycle of birth and death. And so now, the continuation of the sutta, this shows what is called the arahats abiding while alive, especially now in relation to feeling. Okay, so the text says, if he feels a pleasant feeling, he understands it is impermanent, there is no holding to it, no clinging to it, and no delight in it. Again, if he feels a painful feeling, the same. If he feels a neither painful nor pleasant feeling, again the same. Impermanent, there is no holding to it, no delight in it. And so the consequence of that, or just stating the same thing in a somewhat different way, if he feels a pleasant feeling, he feels it detached. Similarly, a painful feeling, a neutral feeling, he feels it detached. And so when he feels a feeling terminating with the body, he understands, I feel a feeling terminating with the body. When he feels a feeling terminating with life, he understands, I feel a feeling terminating with life. And the way I would understand this is that when he experiences any of these feelings, pleasant, painful, or neutral, he understands that these feelings continue only as long as the body stands and as long as the life faculty continues to function. And so he understands, continuing, that on the dissolution of the body, with the ending of life, all that is felt, not being delighted in, will become cool right here. Okay, and this is referring to what's called the nibbana element without residue remaining. So we can say that the previous statements are referring to the nibbana element with a residue remaining. That is the nibbana experienced while one is alive. But now, with the statement on the dissolution of the body with the ending of life, this is going to show the nibbana element with no residue remaining. And the residue are the 5 aggregates that have been brought into being into this life through previous ignorance and craving. And so in an ordinary person, the 5 aggregates come into existence with conception or birth. They continue through the duration of life. And because there's still ignorance and craving within them, sort of underlying them, when these 5 aggregates break up at death, then there's still that ignorance and craving within them that will bring into being a new set of 5 aggregates to continue to keep the process of becoming, evolving or revolving from life to life. But the arhat, or liberated one, has extinguished craving and ignorance. So he knows that on the dissolution of the body at the end of life, since there is no more ignorance and craving, there will be no more re-arising of the 5 aggregates. And so all that is felt here in this life, since it's not being delighted in, there's no attachment and clinging to it, the expression used is that it becomes cool. Sometimes some people think that this means that the arhat is annihilated at death, but what the Buddha teaches is no eternal existence, no annihilation, but rather what I prefer to say is to use a verb and to say that the arhat becomes nibbanized with his death. Okay, then the Buddha illustrates this with the example of the oil lamp. So the oil lamp burns in dependence on oil and a wick, and then when the oil and the wick are used up and it doesn't get any more fuel, then it is extinguished. It goes out from lack of fuel. And so too, when the feelings are not delighted in, see, the delight in the feelings, that is like providing fuel to the fire of craving and ignorance. But when the feelings are not delighted in, then there's no more craving and ignorance. And so then, with the dissolution of the body, with the ending of life, all that is felt, not being delighted in, becomes cool right here. Okay, now at this point, this actually concludes the Buddha's exposition of the foundation of wisdom, which he had started way back when he began to explain the contemplation of the 6 elements. That is, when you go back to page 1089, section 13, the Buddha raises the question. He says, how does one not neglect wisdom? Then he introduces the 6 elements, explains them in turn, and then brings the treatment up to the attainment first of, call this enlightenment or realization in this life, then the nibbana element with residue remaining, that is the arhat's dwelling in the contemplation of feeling, and then the attainment of the nibbana element without residue remaining. So all of that is incorporated under the development of wisdom. And so now the Buddha sort of sums up what has been said to this point. He says, therefore, a bhikkhu or a monk possessing this wisdom possesses the supreme foundation of wisdom. For this is the supreme noble wisdom, namely the knowledge of the destruction of all suffering, of all dukkha. So this is, I mentioned that there are 4 foundations or adhitanas. Okay, the first is called, this is the supreme foundation of wisdom, the Panya Adhitana. And maybe some of you who've done meditation courses in the Goenka tradition might know the word Adhitana with a somewhat different meaning. The word Adhitana has another meaning, which is resolve or determination. Like when you make the determination, I will sit for 1 hour without changing my posture. That determination, that's also adhitana. But here adhitana is being used in a different sense of the foundation or groundwork for something. And so these adhitanas are things, qualities that one develops in the course of practice. And then when they come to fulfillment, then they become the supreme or unsurpassed adhitana, the unsurpassed foundation. And so now this whole process of developing wisdom, one could say, has been the development of the Panya Adhitana, the foundation of wisdom. And then when that wisdom blossoms and matures in the knowledge that all dukkha has been destroyed, then it becomes the supreme foundation of wisdom. Okay, next, now the Buddha is going to go through each of the 4 adhitanas. So now we come to the second one. He says that his deliverance, or actually now I prefer the word liberation. I think the Sri Lankans back in the 1940s, a little influence of the Christian terminology. So one gets, Jesus is my deliverance. And so they picked up, in rendering Buddhist texts, they picked up that expression. And so I continued it through back in those days. I think Ñāṇamoli used deliverance, but now I would prefer liberation. Its Pali word is vimutti. So his liberation, being founded upon truth, is unshakable. For that is false, which has a deceptive nature, and that is true, which has an undeceptive nature, that is nibbana. Okay, this is maybe a statement very pregnant with meanings. That is false, which has a deceptive nature. And there's 2 words here. First, the word translated false, the Pali word is musa. And this is the word, you might be familiar with this, when you take the 5 precepts. The 4th precept is musavada viramani sikappadang samadhiyami. I undertake the precept to abstain from false speech. And then the other word, which is deceptive nature, the Pali expression is mosa dhamma. Dhamma here, as the second part of the compound, means the nature. And it seems mosa must be derived from musa, false. So you could even say, but it sounds tautological to say, that is false, which has a false nature. But I've tried to figure out, if something has a false nature, how is it just not a tautology? So the way I would understand it is that which deceives us is what is false. And what deceives us, or how it deceives us, are things that deceive us by making us take them to be permanent sources of pleasure and security, and to be our true identity, ourself. And so what the Buddha teaches are all conditioned things are impermanent, unsatisfactory and insecure, and not ourself. And so to see them rightly is to see them without deception, is to see things as impermanent, unsatisfactory, and not self. But for ordinary people whose minds are covered with delusion, we see them falsely. And so things have a deceptive nature because they deceive our minds. Okay, so everything with the deceptive nature, everything which is all these impermanent conditioned things, the text says, are false. But that which has an undeceptive nature, which cannot mislead, that is true, the ultimate truth. And that ultimate truth is Nibbana. And so therefore the Buddha says, a bhikkhu possessing this truth possesses the supreme foundation of truth. For this is the supreme noble truth. That is Nibbana, which has an undeceptive nature. And here the expression noble truth is Arya Satya. So that puts Nibbana within the four noble truths. And so we have, the four noble truths are suffering, craving is the origin of suffering, then the cessation of suffering, which is Nibbana, and the Noble Eightfold Path, the way to the cessation of suffering. So of these four noble truths, the first noble truth is something to be seen through, to be fully understood and overcome. That is suffering, especially as dukkha as expressed in the five aggregates. The second noble truth is craving, which is to be discarded or abandoned. And so those are negative noble truths. But even the noble truth of the path is not the ultimate. The path is the means to the goal. And so the path is a noble truth, and it's also a noble practice, but it's not the supreme noble truth, because the supreme noble truth is the goal to which the path leads. And that is Nibbana, the third noble truth, which is the cessation of all suffering. Okay, so this is the second foundation, which in Pali is Satya Adhikana. And the word Satya here, it's exactly the same as the word Satya in the Four Noble Truths. Chattari Arya Satyani. Okay, now we come to the next foundation. So he says, formally, and here, it's difficult to render one language exactly into another language. And sometimes we don't have words that correspond exactly to, which can capture the precise nuances of the word in the original language. So here we say, formerly, when he was ignorant, when this person was ignorant, he undertook and accepted acquisitions. I'll come back and explain that. Now he has abandoned them, cut them off at the root, made them like a palm stump, done away with them so that they are no longer subject to future arising. Okay, the word rendered acquisitions here again, it's one of those words that we don't have an exact counterpart in English. At one point I tried experimenting not with acquisitions, but assets. Usually we think assets are things which are desirable, good to have. A person is evaluated in terms of his assets. How much are you worth? That's your value as a person. What you have in your bank account and your stock holdings and your property holdings, the assets. Okay, but the word upati, according to the commentaries, it has 4 meanings, suggests 4 things. One are the defilements. So greed, hatred, delusion, all the others are our assets, things to be relinquished. Another meaning of upati are the 5 aggregates, because those are the things that we cling to and hold to as being mine and I. Then a third type of assets or upati are external properties or belongings. So I have, this is my house, my car, my land, my job, my bank deposits, my bank account, my stock holdings, even my sons and daughters, wife and husband, all of those things that we hold to and take to be mine, things that sort of define me as a person, those are also acquisitions or assets. So that's the third sense of upati. And then the fourth sense are karmic accumulations, because we do good and bad deeds, and thereby we create wholesome and unwholesome karma, and that karma stays with us. That is really, you say, if anything is ours, it's the deeds that we do, and the karma that's generated by the deeds that we do. And so that karma is, accumulated karma, is a kind of acquisitions or assets. And so for the Buddha, for the ordinary person, the aim, the aspiration is to acquire more and more assets, to build up one's acquisitions. Isn't there the expression in the business world? We have it, when one company acquires another, you call that that's a hostile takeover. Is there another expression used with acquisition?
Mergers.
What is it?
Mergers and acquisitions.
Yeah, merger, but I'm looking for one with the word acquisition. Maybe we could just say one company acquires another, so that's an acquisition. And when it acquires the other, it takes over the other company, victim company's assets. Okay, so that is the way one has a positive valuation on upadi. Or what the Buddha says is that the aim is to abandon these acquisitions, to cut them off at the root, make them like a palm stump which cannot grow again, do away with them so they are no longer subject to future arising. And so then the Buddha says, therefore, one possessing this relinquishment possesses the supreme possesses the supreme foundation of relinquishment. For this is the supreme noble relinquishment, that is the relinquishing of all acquisitions. And the word for relinquishing is pati nisagga. Oh, I'm sorry, it's pati nisagga. But the word that's used here is chaga. Chaga adhitana. So the supreme noble or the foundation of relinquishment is chaga adhitana, and that's explained as the relinquishing pati nisagga of all acquisitions. Pati nisagga is sort of casting away, discarding, giving up of all acquisitions. Okay, now we come to the fourth foundation. So the text says, when he was ignorant, this is before developing wisdom, he experienced covetousness, desire, and lust. Now he has abandoned them, cut them off at the root, and so on. Formerly he experienced and here these terms, covetousness, desire, lust, they're used just as synonyms for the same thing. So in a way they all represent the unwholesome root of greed. Then the second case, he experienced anger, ill will, and hate. Now he has abandoned them, given them up. So anger, ill will, and hate, these are just synonyms for the second unwholesome root, which is dosa, hatred. Then formerly, when he was ignorant, he experienced ignorance and delusion. Again, these are just two synonyms for the unwholesome root of moha, delusion. So now he has abandoned them, cut them off at the root, made them like a palm stump, done away with them so they are no longer subject to future arising. So a bhikkhu possessing this peace possesses the supreme foundation of peace. For this is the supreme noble peace, namely the pacification, the appeasement, calming down of lust, hate, and delusion. And here the word, the operative term here is upasama. So upasama is being used in this passage actually in two senses. One is in the sense of peace, that experienced peace, and the other where we have the pacification of lust, hate, and delusion is the calming down, quieting down, subsiding of these defilements. And so the point that's being conveyed is that it's through the pacification or the calming down and stopping of these defilements that one enjoys the experience of peace. Okay, so now the Buddha sort of sums up this whole long passage that started back with section 11 on page 1089. Now he sort of sums everything up by saying, so it was with reference to this that it was said, one should not neglect wisdom, should preserve truth, should cultivate relinquishment, and should train for peace. Okay, maybe I'll ask whether there's any questions at this point from what we've covered so far. Excuse me? Is somebody speaking? You are. Oh, oh, I see you testing.
Renunciation don't use the word Nikāya and Shanti for peace also.
Say again.
Nikāya, isn't the word Nikāya also used for renunciation? Nikāya.
Yeah, it's used for renunciation.
And peace, Shanti.
Yeah, the word Nikāya does mean renunciation, but it's just not used here. I mean, he has to select some words.
But I suppose this is a slightly different meaning.
Excuse me?
This might have a deeper meaning. Chaga may have a deeper meaning, like Upasama may have a deeper meaning. It may have a slightly different meaning from the English word peace.
Well, I think I explained it the way it's stated in the text, that there are two meanings. One is they call it pacification in the sense of the stilling and stopping of greed, hatred, and delusion. And then sort of building on that is the experiential peace, which is what people aspire for.
Okay, this will be more accurate. These words are more accurate, more exact, these words.
These words? Yeah, these are the words that are used in the text. Any other questions? Okay, then we will continue with Sutta. Okay, now the Buddha is going back to when he gave the opening statement to the young monk after they had exchanged greetings in the potter's shed, when he was giving the outline of the teaching. He said one of the statements that he made was that the tides of conceiving do not sweep over one who stands on these foundations. And when the tides of conceiving no longer sweep over him, he is called a sage at peace. So that was a kind of concise statement that the Buddha made. Now he's going to elaborate upon it. And here we have an expression that I rendered tides of conceiving, or maybe we should say tides of misconceiving. It's a very unusual expression that occurs. I don't think it occurs elsewhere. Yeah, the expression rendered tides of conceiving is man-yusava. The manya part represents manyita, which means something which is conceived or misconceived, or maybe in the sense of being misconceived, a misconception, an idea which is infected with delusion, we can say. And usava is something which swells up. So these are swellings up, or swellings, you could say swellings of deluded ideas. And normally for ordinary people, these tides of conceiving, these swellings of deluded ideas rise up and overwhelm us, and so we are carried away by them. But one who has established these four foundations and perfected them, that is the Arahat, it said that the tides of conceiving no longer sweep over him. And so what are these manyita, these conceivings or misconceptions? And so the next passage states what they are. First comes, in a way there's a sequence here, and it starts with the most fundamental misconception is I am, asmi, that sort of at the center of all my experience, there's some kind of I, which is, it's not even yet considered as a self, but it's just the vague notion that things are happening to me. And when I do things, that I am the one who does things. So this vague, I call it a nebulous notion of an I at the center of experience. The nebulous notion of an I as the agent of activity. Okay, then for the ignorant, undiluted person, because this notion I am is constantly present in the background of all experience, when one starts to reflect on that, one takes the I am for granted and tries to figure out, this is when you start getting philosophical, what am I? Who am I? In my essence, what am I? And then one starts identifying the I am with something. And according to the Buddha, when one identifies the I, it's always identifying with one or another of the five aggregates. So one comes to the notion, or one posits the I in some relation to the five aggregates. So I am the body, or I possess the body. The I is something inside the body, or the body is within this great I. And so for feeling, perception, the mental activities, consciousness, one establishes a relationship between the I and the this, the content of the I. So I am this. That is where this concept or notion of a self emerges, when one gives a content to the vague, nebulous notion of I am. When one comes to the conclusion, I am this is myself. Okay, then when one comes to the idea of a self, then one faces the alternatives of what is the destination of the self, or the destiny, the future destiny. So then there are two alternatives here, and these set out what are called the two fundamental, extreme, wrong views according to Buddhism. That is eternalism, the idea that the self will exist, maintaining its identity for eternity, and annihilationism, the idea that at death the self is annihilated. And so we come to the conceivings, I shall be, that is, I shall exist forever, or I shall not be. That is, I'll be annihilated at death. Even Shakespeare had some inkling. To be or not to be, that is the question. Okay, then the next old conceivings branch out when one takes takes the position, I shall be. So if one assumes I'm going to exist forever, then comes the question, how will I exist? In what particular mode will I exist? And so here the various alternatives are laid out. I shall be possessed of form, that is, I shall have a body forever, the resurrection of the body, and then eternity in a resurrected body. Or I shall be formless, without a body, just a pure spirit or soul existing forever. I shall be percipient, I shall have perception. I shall be non-percipient, without perception. I shall be neither percipient nor non-percipient. So these would represent different philosophical views that were being discussed amongst the philosophers at the time of the Buddha. Okay, so all of these, you could say, it's a whole accumulating mass of views and speculations and ideas, which are all emerging and developing out of that fundamental misconception that I am something real. And so the Buddha now says, conceiving is a disease, conceiving is a tumor or a boil, conceiving is a dart. By overcoming all conceivings, that is, by getting rid of all of these deluded misconceptions, one is called a sage at peace. It is getting rid of these misconceptions, not just through study, learning, reflection, but through wisdom one reaches the ultimate goal, the full maturation of wisdom by which one sees into the truth of selflessness. And so this cuts off all the deluded notions right down to the base, the notion I am. And so without that notion of I am, then one is called, the Pali expression is Muni Santo, which is rendered the sage at peace. So we know Muni from Sakya Muni, which is the sage of the Sakyan clan. And then Santo is related to the word Santi. Shanti is Sanskrit, peace. So this is the peaceful sage. Okay, then comes a very beautiful passage. It says, okay, one is called the sage at peace, and the sage at peace is not born, does not age, does not die. He is not shaken and does not yearn. For there is nothing present in him by which he might be born. So that by which he might be born are the two roots of the cycle of rebirth, that is, ignorance and craving. And now, since he's overcome ignorance and craving, there's nothing to drive on to new existence. So there is nothing present by which he might be born. Not being born, how could he grow old and age? Not aging, how could he die? Since there's no dying, how could he be shaken? Not being shaken, why? should he yearn. And so then the Buddha sort of summed up and said it was with reference to this that it was said, the tides of conceiving do not sweep over one who stands on these foundations. And when the tides of conceiving no longer sweep over him, he is called a sage at peace. Then he says, Bhikkhu, bear in mind this brief exposition of the 6 elements. Okay, now we have to remember that all along the Buddha hasn't revealed his identity to the young man Pukkusāti. And so when they started the conversation, Pukkusāti thought, he's himself is one ascetic, here another ascetic has arrived, and they're just having a conversation. And probably, according to the commentary, the Buddha has sort of subdued his distinctive features, that what's called the 32 marks of the great man, and all of the 80 minor features of bodily excellence. And so maybe with a discerning eye, maybe one could see them, but the Buddha sort of deliberately sort of muffled them so that the young man would just take the Buddha to be another wandering ascetic. But now, as the Buddha was giving this discourse, probably it was occurring to Pukkusāti, could this be the Buddha himself? Could this be the Buddha himself? Then I think when the Buddha gave this exposition on Muni Santu, the sage at peace, then it fully dawned on him that this is the Blessed One, the Master, the Teacher, the Buddha. And so then, the text says, the Venerable Pukkusāti thought, indeed the Teacher has come to me, the Sublime One has come to me, the fully enlightened One has come to me. And probably somehow we realized that the Buddha had come expressly to meet him there. At least that's the way it's phrased in the sutta. So just imagine, like if you were traveling someplace and staying at a hotel or motel for the night, and then somebody checks in to the room next door and then comes to your room and says, can we start a little conversation? And so you have a little conversation, and then he starts speaking and explaining points of Dhamma, and you realize, wow, this guy knows what he's talking about. It's the Buddha himself, wow. And he's come to this Best Western motel or Holiday Inn hotel just to see me. Okay, so then he gets up from his seat, he arranges his robe over one shoulder, and then he bows down at the Buddha's feet and says, he apologizes. If you remember at the beginning of the discourse, he was referring to the Buddha or addressing him by the word avuso, which is the word that fellow ascetics would use when they're addressing their peers. So here it's what's translated as friend. So actually it doesn't really mean friend, but it's just a polite term, a little bit respectful, but used between people roughly on the same level. And so when one is addressing one's master, one's spiritual master, one would use a different word, and the word that's used amongst the Buddhists is the word Bhante. Don't think that when you call me Bhante that you're putting me up on a high pedestal. Now Bhante has come just to mean a senior monk. But in the Buddha's day, it was generally used for the Buddha himself or for very senior elder disciples. And so now Pukkusāti bows down to the Buddha and apologizes for addressing him as avuso. And then he says, may the Blessed One forgive me this transgression for the sake of restraint in the future. Okay, then the Buddha says, this is a stock phrase or passage that comes whenever somebody apologizes to the Buddha. He says, I forgive you for it is growth in the Noble One's discipline when one sees one's transgression as such, makes amends for it, and undertakes restraint in the future. And now Pukkusāti, though he put on the robe himself, probably not the proper monastic robe, but just some pieces of cloth which he had dyed a saffron color and shaved his head. And so he's in a sense a renunciant, a monk, but he's not been ordained into the Buddha's monastic sangha yet. And so, but actually this is interesting, because here he says, I would receive full admission. This is upasampada under the Blessed One. Now, in other passages where there's a wandering ascetic who wants to be ordained under the Buddha, he asks for the going forth. Yeah, he wouldn't ask for the going forth because he's already gone forth, as an ascetic, but now he's asking to be admitted into the Bhikkhu Sangha. So he says, I would receive the full admission or full ordination under the Blessed One. And one of the requirements for ordination is to have, when one comes for ordination, to have the full set of monastic robes and alms bowl. And this is a little puzzling. The Buddha asks him, are your bowl and robes complete? And he says, Venerable Sir, my bowl and robes are not complete. I could see this with the case of the robes, but I would think that since he's been living as a wandering ascetic, he should have an alms bowl. But maybe this is a stock phrase, and so he says, my robes and bowl are not complete. But it would seem to me that he should say, I have an alms bowl, but I don't have the set of robes. And so then the Buddha says, Tathagatas do not give the full admission to anyone whose bowl and robes are not complete. Now normally, if somebody wants to ordain, they would have lay supporters, if they're like in a fixed residence, lay supporters who will provide the robes and the bowl, so then they just have to go to the ordination site and then they'll receive the ordination. But since Pukkusāti was traveling around, he was actually traveling a long distance in order to go see the Buddha, so he doesn't know anybody in this area where he's present now near Rajagaha. And so the Buddha says the Tathagatas do not give the ordination to anyone whose robes and bowl are not complete. And so Pukkusāti then has to go out and start inquiring and seeking, trying to find somebody to provide the robes and the bowl. And so the text says, then while the Venerable Pukkusāti was searching for a bowl and robes, a stray cow killed him. Strangely, this happens in a number of cases to those who are aspiring to become Buddhist monks when they go out seeking their robes and bowl. There's the case also, I'm thinking of Bāhiya in the Udana, Sutta number 10 in the Udana. Bāhiya was the one who came to the Buddha with a strong sense of urgency, asking for a teaching, and then the Buddha gave him this very concise teaching. In the seen, there will be only what is seen. In the heard, only what is heard. In the sensed, only what is sensed. In what is cognized, only what is cognized. And when Bāhiya heard that, immediately he achieved arahantship. And then he was also a wandering ascetic. He wanted to become a monk. The Buddha told him to get his bowl and robes, and when he went to seek the robes and the bowl, he was killed by a stray cow. Okay, so he's killed by the cow, and according to the commentary, when he was killed by the cow, then he fell over on a rubbish heap. Then word came and spread, through the neighborhood that this wandering ascetic was killed, and the word came and it reached King Bimbisara, and King Bimbisara came to see the person who was killed, the ascetic who was killed, and somehow realized that this was his old friend through correspondence, Pukkusāti, formerly the king of Takashila. And so King Bimbisara then arranged a proper cremation for him. Okay, then a number of monks come to the Buddha and they ask the Buddha, they tell the Buddha that the clansman Pukkusāti, who was given a brief instruction by the Blessed One, has died. What is his destination? What is his future course? Then the Buddha says that Pukkusāti practiced in accordance with the Dhamma. He did not trouble me in the interpretation of the Dhamma. With the destruction of the 5 lower fetters, the clansman Pukkusāti has been reborn spontaneously. That's in the pure abodes. And he will attain final Nibbana there without ever returning from that world. I think I have a note that explains what... there's a verse in the Samyutta Nikāya. This is in the first chapter of the Samyutta Nikāya, Sutta number 50, which speaks about a number of disciples of the Buddha who had been reborn in the pure abode called the Aviha. And as soon as they were reborn in that celestial realm, they achieved final liberation. They became arahantship. They attained arahantship. The verse says that they cut off, as soon as they arose, they cut off all the fetters, both those relating to the human realm and those relating to the celestial realms, and now they are fully liberated in mind. But at the time of his death, according to the sutta, Pukkusāti, while listening to the Buddha, he must have, been contemplating and then developing insight on the basis of the Buddha's words. And even while listening, he would have cut off 5 fetters and become a non-returner. Okay, and that takes us to the end of the sutta. I wonder if that clock is correct, because my clock... 10 after. 11:10. 11:10, so that's about... 10 minutes. That's about 7 minutes fast. Okay, so we have some time if anybody has any questions or comments. Okay, Edwin and Richard.
I noticed that, of course, when you want the, if you want the pure abodes, you fall into the material, into the material sphere, which of course here falls into the 20.
Yeah, I think this microphone is making a cracking sound, and then.
I noticed that he was doing it something else.
Maybe if you speak loudly.
Well, in the pure abode, it falls into the 24th to the 27th, Orion, but it states here that it's 16,000, eons, as you see in the Abhidharma. But it's stated that, of course, anyone that falls into that Orion would eventually, of course, become enlightened.
Yeah.
But it's so, when it says you would eventually, will be for how long? When it states here that
it is 16,000 eons. Anyone that falls into that realm, right? So actually, he did now become enlightened because he fell into the material sphere.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. The point that Edwin is making is, I think the point is that he's been reborn in the Aviha pure abode.
Right.
Okay. Immediately upon rebirth, he achieves arahantship, but the lifespan, the fixed lifespan in that pure abode is 16,000.
16,000 eons. Yeah.
16,000 kalpas. Kalpas. These are aeons. And so it's still going to be a very long time until he achieves final nibbana. Is that your point?
Correct.
Yeah. I mean, that's the case. But my supposition is that the sense of time is relative to the consciousness in that realm. So there are these insects like the gnat. It's born and dies within a single day, but probably it has the consciousness of having like 100-year lifespan. So when it's born, it's like frolicking like a little child. When it's, this is maybe 6 a.m., it's frolicking like a child.
Even as a meditation, you may see that happen. A lot of times you sit there, you don't realize an hour already.
So 10 a.m., it's sort of in adolescence, going to school dances, looking for, if it's a male gnat, it's looking for female. For a girlfriend amongst the female gnats. By 1 p.m., it's settled down as a family gnat. By 3 p.m., it's struggling with the problems of old age, and by 6 p.m., it's dead. But it has a sense that, wow, I've lived a full lifespan. And maybe they talk, Thomas Nat, he lived till 8 p.m. Wow, how does he do it? Oh, he eats well, gets plenty of exercise. He doesn't drink or smoke. For them, it's like 1 day is 12 hours, it's 100 years. And so for us, when we think 16,000 aeons, wow, that's a long time. But for them, maybe 16,000, it's just like 180 years.
Maybe it was a message to practice in this life and achieve enlightenment in this life without waiting 16,000 aeons to be reborn there.
Yeah, but the thing is, like, the Buddha encourages disciples to go on and practice till they've reached the final stage in this life. But, there would be many who just reached the third stage of non-returner. Then they're going to be reborn in the pure abodes. And then they have this tremendously long lifespan. Oh, I said that Richard, I had called Richard previously.
Yeah, on page...
I think it's good if you stand up. Yeah, stand up and...
On page 1093, paragraph 23, the light is used twice, and in 24 it's used once.
The what?
And what I'm concerned about is the second usage on paragraph 23. If he feels a painful feeling, he understands it is impermanent.
Yeah.
There is no holding to it. There is no delight
in
it.
Yeah.
But it would look to me like it should mean that, like, the word delight there should somehow mean something like either fear or dread.
Yeah.
The dread being that if he thinks it's going to continue forever, right, that should make it much more awful. Right, as its real dukkha senses that this goes on. And so what I'm wondering about the word delight, because when you said, is not agitated, you were saying that it came from a combination of the words of craving and fear.
Yeah.
And so what I'm thinking is, does the second delight, is that really using the fear sense, whereas the first delight and the third are using the craving sense?
Yeah, okay, I understand your point. I'm not sure that the text intends it in that way. I think what happens, you see, because this is, we call it the style of oral transmission, in that it's not always adapt stock phrases and nuance them in order to fit variations. But in oral transmission, one has to keep phrases fairly simple and consistent, even though when we look at a passage like this, from the standpoint of psychological analysis, we say that the natural reaction to a painful feeling isn't delight, but either dread or repulsion. But here I think it's just because of the method of oral transmission, where one takes one stock phrase and then repeats it for 3 cases, even though it is not fully applicable to one of those cases.
The same kind of thing that happens in ballads and in things like Homer, right? The rosy-fingered dawn happens over and over again. After that, you're starting.
Did Johnny, did you have?
Actually, there's a question on the internet, but one classmate quote the note and answer that. The question is, does Bodhisattva equal to Arahant?
Yeah, it is.
The footnote.
Yeah, it is. Okay, I think we'll break now for the lunch, and then come back here 12:20. Is that too soon? Or 12:30? What's easier? 12:30. Okay, then you can have a more leisurely lunch. Okay, so we'll come back from 12:30 to 1. We can have further discussion. Okay, let us end with the sharing of the merits. Okay, I'll do the recitation. Don't worry about getting the sheets. Okay, so we share the merits with the devas, the bhutas, the nagas. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu sasanam. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu desanam. Akasata chabumata Deva naga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu mang param. Etavatacham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe devanumodantu sabbe bhutanumodantu sabbe satanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya Pavagupadaya avichihetato etantare satakayupapana rupya rupicha asanya sanyino dukkha pamuchantu pusantu nibuting. Okay, we end with 3 half bows to the Buddha. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay, Edwin had this. Yeah. Yeah, first, I'm not sure that the texts say that the Buddha knows everything that's going to happen in the future. Though in this case, I would think he would have been able to know that there was this, karma created by Pukkusāti, which reached a point of maturity such that he was destined to die very soon. But maybe he saw that this, this is like I don't know the answer to this. Maybe, you would say, maybe he saw that the karma was so strongly determined that there was no way to avoid it. Yeah. I'm not quite sure that I understand. Yeah, pure abode, yeah. Yeah. Oh, I see. Okay. Well, I think the point here is that the Buddha is describing the progress of a meditator who reaches this equanimity that's said to be purified, bright and pure and bright. And so I would understand that this would be the equanimity in the fourth jhana. And so here the Buddha is showing the possibility is that one who has reached the fourth jhana can then consider going beyond the fourth jhana in the scale of samadhi by reaching the formless meditative attainments. But this meditator described by the Buddha doesn't go on to reach those attainments because or at least he doesn't dwell in them, because he sees that if he were to dwell in them without developing wisdom, then his consciousness will just re-arise in that corresponding realm, remain there for a long time, and then pass away. And so he'll still be stuck within the cycle of birth and death. Yeah, let's not bring in the Abhidhamma. Yeah. Okay, just keep to the sutta scheme. Yeah. Yeah. He hasn't gone to doesn't get the impression that he's gone to the immaterial attainments. The Buddha explains it. Yeah, so it seems that Pukkusāti, based on the fourth jhana, reached the stage of non-returner. And so on that basis, then he was reborn in the pure abodes. Yeah. Yeah. Paritrishyate. Pali was what? Yeah. 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 Okay. Yeah. The older language of India used for their scriptures preceding the time of Buddhism was Vedic Sanskrit. There are different strata within the Vedas. There's the Samhita, which is the oldest portion. Then come the Brahmanas, the Aranyakas, and the Upanishads. Four layers in the Vedas. I mean, I'm not a Sanskrit scholar or a Vedic scholar, so I don't know what the language is like. But I think even the Upanishads, which is the latest portion, still uses the forms of Vedic Sanskrit. Okay, then let's say the Buddha might be a century, 150 years after the fundamental Upanishads. And the language actually he spoke was not Pali, but it would have been the languages of northeast India, probably Magadhi and maybe Kosalan, and other dialects, which were these languages are grouped together under the designation Middle Indo-Aryan languages, because it's from the middle period. And then Pali is considered to be, they call it a artificial language, which brings together the features of the Eastern spoken languages that the Buddha would have used with features from Western India. So my suspicion is actually that Pali is close to the language that would have been used around the place where Sanchi is located, close to present-day Bhopal, because that is where Mahinda, the son of King Ashoka, and Sangamita, the daughter of King Ashoka, that is where they were based before they went to Sri Lanka. Okay, and so this is the spoken languages like Pali simplify forms that are more complex, even in Vedic Sanskrit. And then after the time of the Buddha, I think this would be even after the time of King Ashoka, who was about 150 years after the Buddha, then Brahmanism flourished. And with the flourishing of Brahmanism, Sanskrit came to be codified, formalized and codified by the Sanskrit grammarians. And then we enter the age of what is called classical Sanskrit, which differs in some respects from Vedic Sanskrit. Then once Sanskrit came to flourish, then Buddhist texts underwent a process of partial Sanskritization. And so that gave rise to a language that's called Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit. Even the Pali Canon has some Sanskrit features, but not as much as texts from other traditions. There was an article by K.R. Norman, I don't remember, I'll have to search for it, which gave a good chronology of the languages. So that was the first question, then you said the second question. Sanskritized, yeah. For example, some forms that we see in Pali that probably were not original to the older Pali texts. We have two forms indicating there, the word there. One is tatta with T-T-H-A. That seems to be the form more natural to Pali. But we also find tatra, T-R-A. So that group, a consonant followed by R, is characteristic of Sanskrit, but not of the Middle Indo-Aryan dialects. And even the word Brahmana for a Brahmin seems to be a feature of, or to indicate a Sanskritization of the text. Because there are some puns in the suttas which don't make sense if one uses the word Brahmana, but they make sense if one uses the word that's been conjectured to have been the form used in the Buddha's time, was Bhamana. And so the the puns make sense if we have Bhamana, but when we change that to Brahmana, then the pun becomes unworkable. No, there would have been, the Sanskrit words would have been there from in the Vedic Sanskrit. Story about, yeah. 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 Yeah, I think I said last week when we started the sutta, I said I was giving the background story to this sutta, if you remember, and then I said this story is coming from the commentary, and sometimes one has to, question the commentaries and the information in the commentaries. And not only the commentaries, even sometimes in the sutta, it will say, for example, well, the thought occurred to so-and-so. And so when I read this, I wonder, how do the compilers of the suttas know that that thought occurred to so-and-so? Anyway, coming back to your question, yeah, the stories, the background stories, where they originate, I don't know. Often they involve some fantastic elements which strain my credulity. So I say, this is what the commentary says, but be careful that don't always think that the commentary is 100% reliable, particularly for background stories, because one could see that as preachers who are giving sermons and discourses on the suttas will feel that, well, to make it interesting, I have to give some background to the sutta. And so they will come up with a very simple story, and then their students will think, the story is too simple, we have to make it more interesting. It gets more elaborate, and their students think, that's still too simple, and then it becomes still more elaborate. And so the story starts snowballing, picking up more and more material till you have a full elaborate account. But maybe in some of the background stories that there are historical elements, this we have to use our judgment to determine. But I say that the commentaries are very valuable in giving explanations of words. Sometimes they play with words. They engage in word plays to bring out, I call this ethical derivations rather than literal, ethical etymologies rather than literal etymologies. So they'll try to explain a word in order to bring out moral meanings, or sometimes using word plays that are not really acceptable. Like, for example, there's the word kusala, which means we take to mean good or wholesome. Okay, so I think one way that they explain that is ku, the prefix ku sometimes means bad. And then there's a verb salati, which means to cut. So kusala is explained as that which cuts the bad. But I don't think that's the original derivation at all. It was just a word of ordinary usage. And then also when the commentaries are giving doctrinal explanations, often what they are doing is interpreting statements or terms in the suttas through the lens of the developed Theravada tradition, especially drawing ideas from the Abhidhamma and drawing upon ideas that come from the elder teachers, the ancient teachers. And so sometimes one has to view these explanations against what the texts themselves say, by looking at other relevant texts and then trying to determine what from this is reliable and what is speculation, or applying a kind of fixed system to terms which didn't have such fixed, definite meanings in the original discourses. Yeah. The idea that it's said that Pali is the Mula Bhasa. What lies behind that expression? Mula Bhasa means the root language, the basic language. This is a commentarial idea that that Pali is sort of the intrinsic language which is sort of imprinted upon the brains, into the brains or the minds of all human beings. So that if you take a child before it's had engaged in conversation with other human beings, when it's an infant, and you bring it up in the wild, so that it's maybe brought up by wolves, and then you bring it back when it reaches maturity into human society, then it won't have been exposed to the corrupting influence of other human languages. So when it starts to speak, to communicate, it will naturally be speaking Pali. So if you want to learn Pali well, you don't have to study the language. Just try to forget all of your other all the corrupting influences of your English and Chinese and French and Spanish, whatever other languages you've learned. Richard, yeah.
You were discussing relationship between false, lie, deceptive.
Yeah.
And also what I'd say is deceit is important. I think that the same kind of usages exist now in English. For instance, there was last night at the Unitarian Church in Westport, there was an occasion in which people showed up to tell each other the worst lies they'd ever told. Okay? And what struck me was that what they thought they were talking about was actually deceit, not lying, because it is possible to deceive someone without actually telling any lie.
Yeah.
Even do it while saying nothing.
Yeah.
Right? Because you can allow them to persist in a false belief, which you know is false, and which friends would assume you would say something about if you knew it and you knew the importance of it back to them. Right? So that it's a hostile act not to correct them. Right? And so deceit is what's really significant as the action of deceiving someone else intentionally. It's much more important than the act of lying, because lying isn't necessary to it. You can also, for instance, deceive one person by telling the truth to another person, when the relationship would signify that if you're willing to tell the truth to the person, say that you know less well, then you were certainly obligated to tell it to the person you knew better. And so you can deceive the person you don't speak to. Right? But while saying only a true statement to someone else. And so, but I found that, at this meeting last night, people weren't making that distinction. They were thinking, well, the religious issue somehow is lying or not lying. The actual injury is incurred by deception, by deceiving. And so I think that what people sense is that, what matters is your knowledge of your own intentions and your own beliefs. Not whether or not you're literally telling the truth or lying.
Can you give an example of deceiving somebody by telling the truth?
Yes, it's a horrible one from my own life. When I was in 8th grade, I was in a math class, an Algebra 1 class, with my next door neighbor, who was who at the end of the class stood up and said "in flas caput" to the math teacher, which in Latin means "you blow the head." Okay, as he was accusing him of being gay at the time. This was 1962.
Yeah.
Okay, and the teacher didn't know what that Latin phrase meant, but Danny and I were both in the same Latin class, so I knew.
Yeah.
And so the teacher said, "Who said that? What does that mean?" Right? Nobody said anything. But then at the end of the day, I went back to the Latin teacher whom I thought I was obligated to because he was an authority, and I said, "It means you blow the head." And so eventually the principal was called for Danny's parents to go in and talk to the vice principal. And for this, I knew a lot was riding for Danny, because he was very proud of his father, and he wanted to get into Annapolis to become a naval officer. And he thought
that an incident like this would blow his chances of everything.
Yeah.
Okay, now he was, I think, too young. It was 8th grade, so I'm not aware of any lasting effect it had. But I knew what I'd done, and he didn't know what I'd done. I made a true statement to the math teacher, whereas my real and deeper obligation was as a friend to him. And so I deceived him about what my relationship was with him and the teacher by making a true statement to the teacher.
Yeah.
It's deceit.
Yeah.
It's not a lie.
Yeah. Okay, anyway, that raises up a lot of issues, but I want to sort of keep it directly relevant to the sutta.
Well, what I'm trying to
yeah.
make my point about this, and that is that this is then translated, which false people, which has a deceptive nature.
Yeah.
I think you see the psychology of truth and lying and all of that they're using is a kind of introverted psychology. It's a knowledge of intentions, spiritual states.
Yeah.
And so they are projecting that knowledge of this, of what they don't want to call the self, onto knowledge. That is, since objective statements are more valued in the West, the translation comes out deceptive nature, but I think they're actually thinking about the intention of deceit.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Does somebody else have comment or question? Okay, then we'll end for the day, and we have a class next week. Don't forget, we already did Sutta number 141. That was before I went away in October. And so next time we will be taking Sutta number 142. And I have to lay my cards on the table now. Maybe this is a sutta that I have some suspicion of the authenticity about. What?
I thought I made a lot of good investment.
Well, you have to find out where my qualms about the sutta are by coming next week. It's called the Dhātuvibhanga Sutta, which is the Exposition of Offerings. And next week we'll go back to the Guanyin Hall. Unless you prefer here, which do you prefer? This is better. Okay, then we can come here. But distance-wise, you mean going up to the...
When it's too cold. Okay.
What is that? What do you prefer then? To myself, it's the same. What do you prefer? Yeah. Okay, then we could come here. Okay, so let us end with 3 half bows to Buddha.